All right, so today we're going deep on vTv Therapeutics, a company that could seriously shake up how we think about diabetes, especially for those folks who are insulin dependent.
Yeah, that's right. And you know what's really got everyone's attention with vTv Therapeutics? It's their leading candidate, cadisegliatin. It could be a real game changer, especially when it comes to something pretty scary for a lot of people with diabetes, severe hypoglycemia.
Okay, now I know some of our listeners might not be totally up on all the latest diabetes stuff, so could you break it down a little? Why is this such a big deal? What makes cadisegliatin so different?
Well, think about it this way. A lot of the diabetes medications out there, they basically tell your pancreas, hey, make more insulin. But cadisegliatin, it takes a different approach. It's what they call a liver-selective glucokinase activator. That means it's primarily working on the liver to manage the glucose.
Okay, I'm following.
Like, imagine your liver's a big reservoir for glucose, right?
Yeah.
Cadisegliatin, it's like a smart valve on that reservoir, carefully controlling how much glucose gets released into the bloodstream.
Ah, that makes sense.
And that's how it could really change things, especially when it comes to minimizing the risk of hypoglycemia. You know, those dangerous blood sugar drops that can happen,
Yeah.
especially with insulin therapy.
Yeah, definitely. So it's not just flooding the system with insulin, it's more like helping the liver get better at handling glucose, fine-tuning things. But how big of a problem are these severe hypoglycemia events? Like, how often do they happen?
It's a huge issue, honestly. And the thing is, right now, there's nothing out there, not a single approved therapy specifically designed to address severe hypoglycemia. And this is for both type 1 and insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. We're talking millions of people worldwide who rely on insulin, constantly worried about these episodes.
So if cadisegliatin actually works the way they're hoping, vTv is looking at a massive untapped market. No wonder there's so much buzz around them. But there's some uncertainty too, right? We got to talk about that FDA clinical hold. What happened there?
Right, so back in July 2024, the FDA put a hold on cadisegliatin's clinical trials. Temporary hold, they said. It wasn't about, like, safety concerns from earlier trials.
Yeah.
More like they found something unexpected in a study, an unusual chromatographic signal. This was during an ADME study, the kind that looks at how the drug's absorbed and broken down in the body.
So more of a technical hiccup than a big safety red flag. What does this hold actually mean, though? Like, everything just grinds to a halt.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
Especially for their phase 3 trial, the one called CTT1. It had just started up, too. And that trial, they were using continuous glucose monitoring, CGM, to get really precise measurements of how cadisegliatin was affecting hypoglycemia reduction.
So basically, vTv and anyone who might want to invest, they're all in a holding pattern for now. This has got to push back the timeline for getting those big results, right?
Absolutely. They're working with the FDA, trying to give them more data and get the hold lifted, but it definitely means delays. Best case, top-line results probably won't be until sometime in 2026.
Man, that's a long time to wait, especially for a treatment that could be so important. But you know what? Even with this roadblock, vTv is still moving forward. They've got some serious support behind them. Let's talk about their partnership with Novo Nordisk.
Ah, yeah, that's an interesting one. It actually goes back to 2007, a licensing agreement where Novo Nordisk got the rights to vTv's glucokinase activator program. Cadisegliatin was part of that. It looks like Novo Nordisk saw the potential in this approach early on.
Wow, so they were already interested in this liver-selective approach back then. But what does it mean for vTv in practical terms, right now?
Well, the big thing is Novo Nordisk has the first right to negotiate. For anything commercial, future partnerships, even buying out vTv, all related to cadisegliatin, of course.
So this small biotech company, they could be swallowed up by a giant in the diabetes world. That's quite a situation.
It definitely makes you wonder, is this like a David and Goliath thing where vTv could benefit hugely from Novo Nordisk's, resources and expertise? Could they help push cadisegliatin to blockbuster level? Or will they get overshadowed, lose control of their big discovery?
It's like a two-sided coin, right? Huge potential for success, but maybe at the cost of some independence. It's fascinating to think about how that all plays out, but let's not lose sight of the ultimate goal here: making life better for people living with diabetes. What does this potential market look like? Who are we talking about helping?
We're talking about a lot of people, a significant chunk of the diabetic population. You've got roughly 8.7 million folks worldwide with type 1 diabetes. They all rely on insulin, and they all face that constant threat of hypoglycemia. And then there's the even bigger group, the ones with insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
Estimates put that somewhere between 46.3 and 92.6 million people worldwide.
Those are some serious numbers. If cadisegliatin really delivers, gets approved for both types of diabetes, we're talking tens of millions of people who desperately need a solution for hypoglycemia.
The potential is huge, but so is the uncertainty. Let's look at where VTV stands financially right now. Market cap is sitting at $44.02 million, 3.19 million shares outstanding. Pretty small in the biotech world, but with a huge range of possibilities.
So how do we even start to wrap our heads around the potential value of this company? With so many unknowns, it seems like a really big gamble with a huge range of outcomes.
You're right, it is. To really understand the potential, we need to look at different scenarios. And, we don't have a crystal ball or anything. Let's start with a conservative outlook, shall we?
Okay, so let's hear those scenarios. What does that conservative outcome look like?
All right, so scenario A, the conservative one. Imagine cadisegliatin gets approved, but only for type 1 diabetes, and only in the U.S. and maybe a few other countries, not a global launch or anything. Focusing on that smaller group of patients could still bring in some decent revenue, maybe peaking around $6.5 to $7 billion globally.
Okay, so even a limited launch, the revenue could be substantial. But what's that mean in terms of per share value, especially if they have to raise more money later on, potentially diluting things?
Right. Well, in this scenario, we might be looking at a per share value somewhere between, let's say, 500 and 750. Not exactly a blockbuster, but definitely a solid return.
Yeah, not bad at all. But what about something a little more moderate, where cadisegliatin gets approved more broadly?
Let's call that scenario B the moderate case. Here, cadisegliatin gets the green light for type 1 diabetes, for sure, but also for some of the higher risk type 2 patients, maybe like 5–10% of that larger population.
Yeah.
Globally, we're talking roughly 20 million people.
So a bigger market, but still not everyone who could benefit from cadisegliatin. What kind of financial impact are we talking about in that case?
That scenario. We could be looking at peak revenue somewhere between $12 and $24 billion. But to get there, they probably need more funding, which means more shares out there. Taking all that into account, we might see per share values land somewhere between $625 and $11,165.
Okay, now we're talking. It's hard not to get excited about that potential. But I gotta ask, what about the best case scenario? The one where cadisegliatin becomes a real, bona fide blockbuster drug.
Scenario C, the bullish one. Picture this. Full approval for both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And Novo Nordisk goes all in, using their global network, their expertise, to really push cadisegliatin out there.
Wow, so we're talking that massive global market we mentioned earlier. What kind of financial impact are we looking at then?
This is where things get really interesting. Peak revenue, it could be huge. We're talking maybe $40 to $85 billion. That's when you can really call it a blockbuster.
Those numbers are wild. But to reach that level of success, they'd need a ton of investment, right? Maybe even an acquisition.
Absolutely. All that investment would definitely affect the share count, whether it's through dilution or a buyout. But even factoring that in, per share values could skyrocket. We could be looking at anything between $1,000 and $1,500.
That's a pretty amazing return. But we got to be realistic too, right? Things don't always go as planned. What does the not so optimistic scenario look like?
That brings us to scenario D, the pessimistic one. Let's say that FDA clinical hold just drags on, or maybe the phase 3 trial data isn't what everyone's hoping for. Approval gets delayed, not many people end up using the drug, maybe it only gets approved for type 1 diabetes with very low uptake.
Basically, a much smaller market and a lot less excitement from investors. How would that impact VTV's valuation?
In that scenario, peak revenue might struggle to reach $3 billion globally. And if they need to raise more capital, well, they might have to do it at a lower share price. Per share value could take a real hit, maybe dropping to a range of $67 to $100.
Wow, that's a big difference compared to those other scenarios. Really shows how unpredictable the biotech world can be.
It does. It's high risk, high reward. But with vTv Therapeutics, the stakes are even higher, because cadisegliatin could have such a huge impact on so many people's lives.
It's a fascinating story, from the science to the human impact. But with all this talk about valuations and projections, it's easy to forget about the people at the heart of it all.
Yeah, you're right. We're talking about a treatment that could completely change how people with diabetes live their lives, taking away that fear of hypoglycemia, giving them more peace of mind, a better quality of life.
Imagine that impact. Less anxiety, more freedom. It's pretty remarkable to think about. But let's shift gears a bit here. What does cadisegliatin tell us about the bigger trends in biotech and drug development?
Cadisegliatin is a great example of a few key trends that are really shaping the industry. First, there's this growing focus on precision medicine. developing treatments that are tailored to specific patient needs. Cadisegliatin is all about that, zeroing in on hypoglycemia and insulin-dependent diabetes. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's designed for a very specific challenge.
So moving away from those broad solutions and getting more specific, really targeting the root causes of different conditions, that's pretty cool.
It is. And it leads right into the second trend, the importance of biomarkers and personalized data in drug development. Like vTv's phase 3 trial, they're using CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. That tech gives them real-time data on blood sugar levels, which is super valuable for understanding how different people respond to cadisegliatin.
So it's about gathering more information, seeing how individuals react to the treatment, and ultimately developing more effective therapies that are truly personalized. Is that right?
Exactly. And lastly, cadisegliatin shows us how important strategic partnerships are in biotech. Smaller companies like vTv, they often don't have the resources to get a drug all the way to market on their own. So these collaborations with bigger players like Novo Nordisk are becoming absolutely essential.
Seems like everyone wins in that situation. Small companies get the funding, the expertise, the distribution networks, and the big companies, they get to tap into the latest innovations, expand their portfolio.
Exactly. And if you're interested in the biotech world, understanding these broader trends is really key. It's not just about individual companies or drugs. It's about seeing the bigger picture, the forces that are shaping the future of medicine.
And vTv Therapeutics, with this potentially revolutionary diabetes treatment, they're right at the cutting edge of all of that.
Definitely a story to keep an eye on, not just for investors, but for anyone who's interested in the future of healthcare. The power of innovation to actually change people's lives.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot today, from the science behind cadisegliatin to the market forces at play. What are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with today? It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? Exploring vTv Therapeutics and their potential breakthrough for diabetes. So if we had to boil it all down, what are the big takeaways? What should our listeners really remember about vTv?
Well, the main thing, I think, is that cadisegliatin could be a real game changer, like a whole new way of thinking about how we manage diabetes, especially for those who rely on insulin, giving new hope to those millions who are always dealing with the fear of hypoglycemia.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful thought. And it's not just hype, right? We talked about the science, how cadisegliatin actually works. It could really be revolutionary.
Exactly. By focusing on the liver, cadisegliatin could be the key to regulating glucose in a much smarter way, potentially minimizing those scary blood sugar drops that just haunt so many people who depend on insulin.
So it's a much more targeted approach, getting to the root of the problem, not just reacting after the fact. But, we can't ignore the challenge either. That FDA clinical hold definitely throws a wrench in things.
True, true. Biotech investing always comes with risks, especially when you're talking about a company in clinical trials. And vTv is no different. But the potential payoff, it's huge. If cadisegliatin does what they're hoping, it could transform how we treat diabetes. And for investors, well, the returns could be substantial.
It's that classic biotech story, right? Big risks, big rewards. And of course, there's that whole Novo Nordisk partnership. A real David and Goliath situation with all the possibilities and questions that come with it.
Absolutely. That partnership, it's a mixed bag. Novo Nordisk, they have the resources, the expertise that could really take cadisegliatin to the next level. Fast-track development, launch it globally, maybe even make it a blockbuster drug. But then there's the question of control, Does vTv lose some of their independence in the process? That's a trade-off.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance to strike. But at the end of the day, what really matters is how this affects people's lives. We're talking about a treatment that could give millions of people with diabetes some real peace of mind. No more constant fear of hypoglycemia, a chance to live a better, more normal life.
That's the part that really gets me, the human side of all this. vTv Therapeutics, they're at a crossroads right now. They have the potential to change how we think about diabetes. The next few months will be really telling. We'll see what happens with the FDA clinical hold, how the phase 3 trial progresses, and what moves Novo Nordisk makes.
It's a story that's still being written,
Correct.
and it could have a huge impact on the future of healthcare. So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there a final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I'd say, think about this. Knowing all the potential benefits and all the risks involved, would you invest in vTv Therapeutics? It's not an easy decision. You have to look at the science, the market, and your own comfort level with risk. But the chance to be part of something that could truly revolutionize diabetes care, that's something worth considering.
That's a great point to end on. Informed decision-making is so important in the world of biotech. We hope this deep dive has given you the information you need to learn more about vTv Therapeutics and to make your own decisions. So until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep on diving deep.